Welcome to the inaugural Thinking God podcast, a weekly podcast featuring discussions with leading writers, speakers, educators, and artists who take spirituality seriously and who share the conclusion that hope is still a viable option. The goal is to find valuable insights into embracing a path of faith, replacing dogma and closed thought with some ideas and concepts which might shine light into those dark corners. Today's guest is Peter Enns, who, as it turns out, is not only an insightful writer and scholar and speaker, but he's also genuinely a nice guy. Peter Enns first caught my attention with his book, Inspiration and Incarnation, which challenged a number of evangelical presuppositions about the Bible while at the same time encouraging readers to take both seriously the divine and human aspects of Scripture. It was really a breath of fresh air in a world of stale arguments over who believes the Bible the most and who believes it the best among believers. I know that's a real issue, at least in my part of the country and in the circles I run in. His book, The Bible Tells Me So, which in many ways is sort of a layman's Inspiration and Incarnation, might be my favorite, and I bought a number of copies of that book and distributed them to families and friends. So, Enns is also the Abram S. Clemens Professor of Biblical Studies at Eastern University, and I got that right?
You bet.
Okay, and I appreciate him taking time to join us on the Thinking God podcast. You have written quite a few books, and like I said, I mentioned to you, I've read several of them. Inspiration and Incarnation was the first one that really got you into trouble. Did you know at the time you were writing that it was going to cause the sort of uproar it did?
No, I mean, I knew it was going to spark, let's say, some disagreement and debate, but that was intentional. You know, when you have a book that says, I'm not sure evangelicals get the Old Testament right, you're going to have some pushback. But I think, you know, where I taught at the time at Westminster Seminary, it was an unfortunate sort of turn of events because the content of the book, I'd been teaching there for about 10 years with no controversy. But as I was writing it, as it was being published, there was a significant turnover in administration and faculty. And so, it's one of those situations where, I find myself, sort of, let's say on the left part of that conversation, and all of a sudden I'm outside of the boundaries, but I didn't move an inch.
Well, that book actually, though, sort of set your entire life in a new direction, didn't it?
Yeah, I'd like to think it played a part in it. I'm hoping God had something to do with that too, so not just the book. But it's a book that I really wanted to write, and I was encouraged by several people to write something like that that would engage, let's say a popular audience more than an academic audience. But although it affects both. But when you write books that people read, then people are going to read them, and it can. Sort of make people think, and there are a lot of things that I wrote, very, let's say, mainstream evangelicals would say things similar to that, but usually in footnotes someplace. This is a whole book dedicated to the idea. So, yeah, that I would say that it was a significant part of, let's say, a journey that I was taking, and there you have it.
Right. Well, I'm glad you mentioned up until that point. You really, you're like I said, a chair professor. You've been writing a lot of scholarly books up until that point. Not that this one wasn't scholarly, but you wrote the thing on Exodus and wisdom literature,
right?
And so this was your sort of. And labels don't really mean a whole lot, but really into sort of the mainstream, sort of popular, sort of kind of book.
Yes, I mean, sort of, Greg. I think it was almost a transition book because Inspiration and Incarnation, or I&I, as we call it, as we insiders call it, I&I, or I squared, whatever you want to say. But it's not really a popular book because I'd say my audience was people who are really students of Bible, which means seminary students or maybe college students. And it's not the kind of book that I think, the average person will pick up and read. So I think it's sort of an in-between place between something that is primarily written for a scholarly community and then something that's written for primarily, what I call normal people, just sitting in the pew or just have some interest, or maybe you don't go to church at all. That's where, the Bible Tells Me So, and my last book, The Sin of Certainty, I think those are very much in that vein of a trade book or a popular book. But I sort of in the middle, it was a transition point. And But the thing is that because it was more widely read, I mean, it's still selling. It's been 10 years. There's a second anniversary edition that came out last year, 10th anniversary edition that came out last year, second edition. And, it's gratifying, but it just, shows that there are people who want to talk about these kinds of things, and the issues aren't going away.
Right. And it also shows that, and one of the things I noticed when I was doing a little, like I said, I was somewhat familiar with you from reading your books, but it also shows when I was doing a little internet research how many websites popped up that really don't like that book.
Yeah, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, I'm not offended by that. It's when you write about the Bible or God, guess what? People are going to disagree with you, But I sometimes listen to the kinds of criticism, and sometimes it's let's just say more reasoned than others.
Right.
No person has a handle on how God works, right? So I'm fine with that. But when the responses are like really condescending or belligerent, I've learned over the years that there's probably some kind of fear behind that, and I try to listen to what are they afraid of, and then I want to approach that, but. People do what they do. It's the internet, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's you mentioned your most recent book. I want to talk about it. It's on Sin of Certainty, and I think it was a really sort of natural follow up to The Bible Tells Me So. As I mentioned to you a minute ago, I have given that book to a number of people that I'm not sure would have been open to that message had it been a little more heady or a little more strident. And I think that the new one, the Sin of Certainty, you actually include almost more personal stories about your own journey away from the idea of chasing certainty and moving towards trust. That seems to be the theme that's running there. And it came out of some difficult times in your own life. I know I mentioned to you a minute ago that we come from at least a somewhat shared tradition among evangelicals, especially where the Bible's concerned, where the Bible almost was elevated to the fourth member of the Trinity, and they held a little truck for those who weren't willing to at least pretend that they were as certain as everybody else of what the Bible was supposed to say.
Right.
And I think I mentioned to you before we started, I once literally saw two Southern Baptist ministers slapping at each other on the convention floor over the Chicago Council on Inerrancy particular. So
praise God. Yeah. Well, like some people say, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Scriptures. So, because that's the Holy Spirit's role, right, to sort of inspire the thing, then get out of the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, how did you reach the point? I mean, you mentioned it. You dealt with it some in your book, The Sin of Certainty, your newest book, which people can get on Amazon or just about anywhere else. It's everywhere. How did it begin to sort of? What was the genesis in your mind that the idea of really having to be certain about anything was an approach that was just not working very well?
That's a good question. Where did it start? Like most things that in my life that are lasting and helpful, I can't really point to a moment. It just sort of like all of a sudden I'm in a different place. But there were certain sort of signposts along the way, I guess, that that led me to sort of making some shifts. Probably, I guess, like I say in the book, life happened. And that's sort of how it usually works with people. It's not like, I want to think differently, but you have experiences that leave, your current paradigm, your current way of looking at the nature of reality and your faith. All of a sudden, those things stop having any real explanatory power. They're not satisfying. This doesn't make sense. The way I live and what I see and what I experience, and, whether it's good things or neutral things or whatever, you realize that, I'm not sure that this is really any good anymore, and for me, one of those things, and I think, I'm sort of not alone in this, but this is part of sort of the evangelical and fundamentalist matrix. I was realizing that, I'm not really sure about the things that I've always had to be sure about, especially teaching at a very conservative seminary like Westminster, where you have a very detailed doctrinal statement where it doesn't leave much room for exploratory theology. It's all pretty much laid out. And, and just realizing that for me, if it works for other people, that's fine. But for me, I just had too many experiences that demanded certain series of questions that would not be helped by certain, doctrinal statements. So, it's life. It's and not just professional, but personal, and I think, it's hard to think of, a human being who hasn't had similar experiences that I've had. It's nothing unusual. It's nothing, as difficult as some people I know have gone through. But yet it's my experiences and it's my life that made me realize that, this whole God thing is a lot bigger and mysterious than what you've been taught and how you've actually been processing information. So it's time to sort of erase, I guess, some things and think differently about this.
Right. Oh, I find your approach in The Sin of Certainty and The Bible Tells Me So in your recent books seems to be, at least the focus seems to be a little different than some of the other folks who are writing about this same issue. Guys like Peter Rollins, who's another very interesting writer, who has written about breaking the addiction to certainty and living in the world. You seem to come back to the idea that trusting God is sort of the key to making any of it make sense. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, and I think, the particular angle that I have is because, I'm not a philosopher, although I play one on TV, but I'm not a philosopher. I'm not, a trained theologian, although, going to seminary and being a seminary professor, you're certainly involved in that. My training is biblical studies. And I still love doing that. And so I come at it from an angle of, the Bible itself deconstructs this idea of you have to be certain all the time, because you have these voices in the Bible that don't do that. And this idea of trusting God is just all over the place in the Bible. So yeah, I think that's a way of putting it. It's not certainty, but it's trusting God even when you don't feel, well, especially when you don't feel certain anymore. And in that respect, join the club of, the history of Christianity. And I would say also the kind of faith that's documented in the Bible. And I think that's pretty cool, quite frankly.
Right. Well, you mentioned two things there I wanted to talk about. First, I was going to ask you, do you think that that approach is, as a biblical scholar, do you think that approach is really more of a roots-based historical understanding of the Bible, which you've been writing about?
Well, that's a good question. I think it could very well be. I mean, I do see that in text. In the book, I talk about what, in the Bible, when it uses words like faith or believe, almost all the time you can simply put in the word trust, and that's really what's happening. It's not about a belief system. It's not about a set of doctrines. Even though there's content, to the faith, it's not like they're sort of screaming into the void and trusting a nameless God. But the nature of the relationship between the person of faith and God is really marked by trusting God no matter what, and trusting God enough to be honest with God, to complain and to argue, and to say, I don't get it right now. I'm not really very happy about it. Right? That's an act of trust as well. And I see that sort of as, I'd say, an important part, a neglected part of the historical Christian faith, which includes also certainly Judaism, because 3/4 of our Bible, is produced within a pre-Christian matrix. So, I think it is, and I think it's a part of the biblical story that, as I said, it's not taught. It's there, and people talk about it. And you've mentioned some. Walter Brueggemann's another person who talks about it quite a bit. Greg Boyd wrote a great book a few years ago on doubt, and people talk about it, but it's not often taught, at least in the church traditions that I'm familiar with. Living in this system for many years now. So. And I think that's a shame. And I think getting people back to the Bible, boy, I hate to sound like a raving fundamentalist, getting back to the Bible and saying,
J. Vernon McGee,
and seeing the diversity of points of view there, and how there are people who are sometimes very strong in their faith and others who are clearly not strong in their faith. They're struggling, and that's all part of the biblical witness. That the editors of the Bible, the Old Testament after the exile, this is a part of their tradition they valued, right? So why shouldn't we?
Well, I'm going to go back to the Bible tells me so. I got a really good personal story. I gave that book to a couple of friends of mine who are pastors, both of them well-educated, bright men. They're in the early 50s. And one of them said it just sort of opened a window for him, and it really has helped him. The other one, he's just talking about, of course, he said, I'm sophisticated enough that nobody knows it in my church, but he said it's created such a deconstruction that I'm not sure where to stop. He's had trouble figuring out I don't believe this anymore. I don't believe this anymore. What do I believe? And he said, of course, he's isolated because as many pastors are, he's in an area where there's not really a lot of place to sit down and talk to somebody and get feedback. We talk on the phone. He didn't live around here.
Right.
What you mentioned the word deconstruction. How does somebody measure when you're deciding, okay, these things I have always just sort of accepted but never really explored. Now I want to try to trust God and not look for a Bible verse to fix my transmission in my car. Yeah. How does a person know where to stop in that?
Well, I don't think a person does know where to stop, and that's why this is difficult to do if you're like in a position of spiritual leadership. Especially if the church culture is one where you're not supposed to do that sort of thing. You're supposed to just know what you believe and not go through periods where you're just not sure. It's hard for pastors. I mean, unfortunately, I think pastors could actually model something for churches, but it wouldn't really be accepted. Right. So let me just say that. I think it's difficult for some people. I had the luxury, so to speak, of processing a lot of this while I was out of work.
But you were out of work because you were processing this and deconstructing.
Well, yeah, but not as deeply as I was out of work. I mean, to be blunt about it, because I wrote a book that some people on the faculty were determined they did not want to be part of their tradition. Mm-hmm. But Inspiration and Incarnation is not. It's not the fruit of that processing that we're talking about here with like the sin of certainty. Mm-hmm. That's something that came after because, the book's not a memoir, but I do call upon personal experiences because I think it's important when you're talking about like the nature of faith and doubt, you have to talk about your own experiences. And for me, it was really a collapse of two worlds that I had complete control over heretofore. One is my professional life. The other is my family life. And, on the latter, I talk as briefly as I can because it's not my story, but, one of my children has significant, a long-standing struggle with anxiety and depression from a very young age. And that was difficult for me because I wanted to fix that, but I couldn't. And that made it worse. So, trying to control that and then trying to control people's perceptions of me at work, which was, a lost battle from the beginning. My life was disintegrating. And that is all post Inspiration and Incarnation. That book, generated, let's say, the impetus for me to leave Westminster. But it was only after I left that, sort of like your pastor friend, I remember, for a while, it was a great relief to be out. But then after a while, I started thinking to myself, I'm so used to having the nature of my faith, circumscribed very clearly. I don't have that anymore. I have no one telling me what to believe. Nobody. And how far does this go? And what do I really believe anyway? Right. And so I had to sort of over time, and I'm skipping an awful lot here, but over time I had to, I guess, reconstruct let's call it my belief system, what do I believe? And a big part of that, because of a lot of influences of people that I read and people that I know, a lot of that came to be just a recognition that a big part of faith is simply understanding that you don't know an awful lot. You can believe things, but you can't be certain about things, right? And that's that's a process that I went through, and that your pastor friend that you talked to. I mean, he's sort of in that as well. And I guess just coming to a point where I could articulate to myself that faith is not about being sure and about being certain. It's about what you do when you're not sure and you're not certain. And that is like you have choices at that time. You always have a choice whether to trust or to fear. And that's a daily choice I think we have to make. And
Well, yeah, and I think that what opened the door to both these friends of mine, one in particular was saying that what made your book, the one I'm talking about now, The Bible Tells Me So, the one before the new one, The Sin of Certainty, was that you, unlike some of the books they had read that were sort of deconstruction in their approach, that they sensed a very clear and abiding love for God and trust in God, while at the same time you were exploring these issues. Is that something you
Yeah, that's, mission accomplished. See, when people come to that point of view, and that's why it's very somewhere between discouraging and annoying to me when occasionally people say, I read your book, but you're totally negative. There's nothing here to take away from it. It's all about bad, 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 bad. It's like, well, that you can have your perception. My perception is that it's not like that. I'm actually trying to put these things in a different kind of framework. They're usually put in a very negative, like Bible bad, God bad kind of framework. But me, it's like, hey, it is what it is. And faith in God doesn't depend on having these questions ironed out. So let's talk about, faith-seeking understanding, as the old saying goes, rather than I have to understand first so that I can have faith.
Why do you think that so many people, I'm not talking about leaders now, just the average person who is seeking some sort of spiritual path, particularly if you've been raised in a tradition where certainty really was, even though maybe not described in that way, a very real part of it. You mentioned fear. Why are they afraid to even explore the idea that the Bible may not be any less valuable if you don't have it all figured out or have to defend it?
Well, I think because one of the perks of let's just stay with Christian faith here. One of the perks of Christian faith is that your entire life narrative and your afterlife narrative is ironed out. And when you feel like holes are being poked in that narrative, it's distressing. And I think it is fear-producing. I was talking to a friend of mine. Actually, I work with him now, Ken Sparks, a name some of the people listening may know. But years ago, it might have been 10 years ago, we were having lunch or something, and we were talking about this issue of fear that makes people react in certain ways to new ideas. And I said it, I think there is a fear behind it. And he said specifically, I think it's a fear of not knowing what happens to you after you die. And I said, no, I don't think that's too specific. But over time, I've thought about that. And I said, I think he's onto something. I think at the end of the day, there's a fear that if I start wondering, like, is the Adam story about history, or is it like a metaphor or myth? Right? If I go down that path, at the end of the day, I can't trust anything in the Bible. And if I can't trust anything in the Bible, I don't know what's going to happen to me when I die. And I don't know if I'm going to see people who I've lost who are no longer here anymore. I don't know if I'm going to see them again. And so that becomes then a pastoral issue, right? But I think that's a big thing that's behind it. Your whole narrative for how you make sense of yourself, God, the world, your place in the world, that can unravel if you start poking holes in the Bible. And that's unfortunate because the reason it can unravel rather quickly is because how the Bible has been set up to function in the life of faith for many people, which is as basically a book that answers all questions, not a book that raises questions. Mm-hmm. The problem is that when you start reading the Bible, that's exactly what happens. You start having questions raised in your mind about, well, how can this be compatible with that? Is this really real? Is this a story? What am I reading here? And to create church cultures where the exploration of faith and even the role of doubt are valued and not vilified. I think that's something that is a hard place to get to, and I really sympathize with people who, are trying to sort of suppress questions that they have. It's the old metaphor about a beach ball underneath the pool surface. You can keep one or two down, maybe three if you sit on one, but if you got 5 or 6, it comes erupting to the surface. And it's a shame that cultures of faith are set up for that kind of thing to happen very often, instead of letting the exploration be a part of the expression of faith, which I think, if I can speak in blanket terms, Judaism, I think, does better than Christianity about debating and arguing and not knowing. And I think a lot of iterations of the Christian faith through history have been understanding of the fact that a lot of theology is what we don't know. not what we do know.
Well, I think that's a great point, because the Talmud is questions, and it includes not only the majority opinion, but it maintains the minority opinion as well.
Right.
I think I'd read an essay somewhere. A rabbi was talking about they do that because 100 years later they find out sometimes the minority opinion was right.
That's
because
right.
they kept it in there. But you mentioned the afterlife. I grew up in the Deep South. Like I said, I grew up Southern Baptist, went to 2 Southern Baptist seminaries, and the laser focus on the afterlife, on who's going to hell. And even now, I mean, you look at the majority of the churches, over 10,000 people or more. There's one right here, the second largest church in the country is right here in Anderson, South Carolina, a very small southern. It focuses so much on what are you doing to make sure people don't go to hell. And I know Rob Bell's book was not anywhere near the first, but it was probably the one, like you were talking about earlier, the more accessible reason that says, why are we starting with hell and not starting with God? Mm-hmm. And that focus on an obsession with where am I going to go when I die leaves so many people at a loss on where to live.
Right. Which is, I think, ignoring, if I may say, the Bible, the biblical witness, which, you have some things there. Paul in moments of stress and crisis talks about the same Philippians, for example. That's a good example. But how much does Jesus talk about that? Right? Not a lot. How much does the rest of the New Testament talk about it? It's there, but it's not like the main theme. The main theme is how Christians live in community with each other, how you live in the world around you. And we see snapshots there of what it looks like, say, in the first century, to live as followers of Jesus, God's Messiah, the climax of Israel's story, what it means to live like that in a Greco-Roman world. And we get to try to transpose that, to other cultures and other moments and other times. That's a task of theology. But yeah, I mean, the focus on to make as a primary point, the Bible basically, teaches us about how to escape hell. I defy anyone to show me where this is a dominant theme in anywhere in the Bible. It's not.
Right. And if you wanted to try to pick the only place that is even close to the way it's presented in its conclusion, they never present the front end of it is in Matthew 25. Basically, right. That's the only place, that little place on the end of it. They like to take the little part on the end about being cast into the lake of fire or something, right. But they don't want to talk about how those people were.
What they did to get cast into.
How are your students now? Eastern University, I know you have a mix of students. There are people that are faith, people without faith. How do they respond to this message of trust and not looking at the Bible as some sort of textbook, science book, something that it was never meant to be?
Well, I think generally very positively, unless they're not telling me something. But I think Eastern is a diverse place. And it's always been that way. We have a broad range of theological positions and temperaments, on the faculty and in the administration. So it's a little bit easier, there than it might be in some other settings. But I think generally speaking, I just, with students and with colleagues and with others, this is something that I think is, it's being received very favorably. And I'm glad for that, because, I'm not inventing anything. I'm not the first person to think about this sort of stuff. So it's more getting connected, I think, with a strand of the Christian faith that is sort of buried in sort of this modernist paradigm for the Christian faith that I think many people hold to, which is, a modernist paradigm, meaning, certainty, mm-hmm. and things can be assessed essentially on an intellectual basis. And so you have, 45-minute sermons, which tend to be lectures, because the fundamental way of getting connected with God is through your head. And I'll never deny the importance of the mind. I mean, I live in that world and I like it, right? But it's not everything. And when it becomes absolutized, that, the Christian faith rises or falls with certain arguments and certain proofs, that never works. That just never works.
Well, and that's why I think some people, among them guys like Brian McLaren, have talked about how each tradition brings something to the table.
Right.
We need the charismatics, and we need the folks who are on the more scholastic side to kind of bring those both to the table, but not to throw them into a blender and turn them into some kind of mush, but just to bring a different. But one of the reasons I started this podcast is there's so many people who just seem to be moving away from hope and certainty. I know a recent study found that 25% of millennials not only don't believe in God, they don't really consider themselves atheists per se. They just see the concept of God as irrelevant. And
right.
that number is even stranger. I saw in Iceland, 100% of Icelanders under 25 do not believe the world was created by God or that God is relevant at all.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you respond? Like you said, you have a lot of international students and a lot of diversity. How do you respond not only to students, but to our other humans that we're walking around the planet on who are not only not seeking certainty of any kind, they just see this whole idea of a search as irrelevant?
I just want to say God hates you and wants to strike you down. Oh, no, wait. I'm sorry. That's what I was thinking. I didn't mean to say that. No.
Having a flashback there.
Yeah, just a flashback. Oh, what happened? What happened? I'm okay. All right, here we go. No, I do talk with people, who think along those same lines. They're all around me. I'm not in a cocoon someplace. And I just say, on one level, I don't blame you. I don't blame you for coming to that conclusion, because the God that you're thinking about is one that is, I hate talking in, technical gobbledygook terms, but I think it is a God that is more captured by a modernist way of thinking about the nature of reality, like objective reality, and God is something there should be evidence for, and if there's no evidence, blah blah blah, this and that, and not a clear understanding of how I think science, which I love and is great, can't answer questions of ultimate meaning. I don't think God can be tested for, right? In other words, I think it's missing an element that has been a part of the Christian faith for much of its history, which is a true respect for the mystery and the otherness of God, and where God is not a being that you can sort of like, I see no evidence for God up here in the sky, so that must be false. Or the Bible says weird stuff and it's dumb and it's irrelevant. Therefore, none of this means anything. I want to challenge people not to reject the God of a particular cultural trapping, and to think maybe what you're rejecting may not be God at all, but it may be how people have constructed God. And you see these things on the news or, on cable TV or whatever. So I get it. Thing is that, I don't want to look at these people and say, boy, you're dumb. Actually, I understand. See, if my options are that kind of God or nothing, I'm with nothing.
Right.
Right. I'm not there. I actually agree with them. I'm just saying like that God is, I don't recognize as God either. I used to, but I don't right now.
Those are great points. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm the same way. I don't believe in that God either, but I used to as well. I came out of the tradition where, it was, hey, do you know where you're going to go to heaven or hell if you die? Not anything else, that was so hammered in. But the idea that nobody cares about that anymore. I say nobody. It has become less and less relevant with every pass. And you mentioned science. I think one of the things that I think voices like yours are important in the theological world, in the same way that science is self-correcting. Sometimes it takes a number of years, but generation after generation, science sort of corrects itself. We got that wrong. We're getting this right.
Right.
The idea of certainty, though, is we may have gotten that wrong, but we're not going to give any ground on it, because if we do, people will start doubting our whole message, and
right.
It's a house of cards rather than, hey, we can admit we were wrong here, but we weren't wrong about the fact that there is a God you can trust in.
Right. And the problem is that when we put everything sort of into the same basket, like it's all or nothing, like our entire theological narrative has to be correct. The classic is, at least I shouldn't say the classic, but what I see recurring with the evolution discussion. If Adam is not a real person, there's no fall, therefore there's no gospel, there's no need for Jesus to come. That's an all or nothing kind of argument that sort of presumes the validity of a particular narrative. But, looking at the Bible, there are actually other narratives in both Judaism and Christianity about what Adam represents and what the whole story is about, that I think can expand our minds, saying, listen, maybe maybe we shouldn't be equating our theological system with God. Maybe our theological systems are always in a process of, we should be open when change is necessary, right? Whether it's because we know the earth is round now and not flat, or we know there was no first human couple, right? Maybe our theology should be held a bit more gently. But what are you going to tell people? I don't know. I'm going to try to live a certain way with people. And I might not have an argument because I'm not sure arguments are actually the thing that work anyway. It's more in community, people living certain ways that people say, there's something there that I want access to, that I want to be a part of. And the Bible calls that love. And, in First John, was it chapter 4 or chapter 3, someplace, that, to paraphrase, none of us have ever seen God, but if we love one another, that is where God is manifest in a community that other people can see and say, there's something big going on here. And no, they may not have all the doctrinal points of, a 33-chapter doctrinal statement or a 50-point doctrinal statement, but, that can come. Those kinds of doctrinal discussions or theological discussions that can come, but that's sort of talk is absurd apart from a deeper context of, I think, community united in humility and love, and that is a very to me that's a non-negotiable biblical teaching if you want to talk that way. That's Paul talks more about humility and pride than almost any other topic except for Jesus' resurrection, I think.
Well, I think you're right, and I think I know from in my faith journey, I spent a number of years with those sort of ugly twin idols of had to be certain about the Bible, and really, and I studied the languages and felt like I had to be able to defend it, and also the sort of its ugly sister is the idol of my own goodness. I felt like I had to be good enough, and instead of trusting God, I was trusting my own ability to suck it up and do good things and be a good person. And
you're really screwed up, aren't you?
Absolutely, which makes me a perfect candidate for this faith we're talking about.
I'm glad I'm not.
Yeah, really. Well, that's why I'm having to do this podcast, see if I can get some help. But
yeah, right.
But it there's such a freedom, and it's it's an exhaling when you begin to think it is about trusting God, and that there's hope, and it's not about us, but it's about us in community. It's not we're not the last man standing that's going to have to fix the world and make sure everybody gets Jesus right.
Right. I mean, the earth is so, people have been around for so long, and there is, I think what people pick up on, there is an arrogance in thinking that, I pretty much have that all figured out. I have the human story figured out, and I understand the universe, and which I think is sometimes implied. There are no serious questions afoot, and because how things work. And the problem there is that, and this is what I get into in the sin of certainty, but the problem is that life gets in the way of that pretty quickly, and to clutter up that neat, tidy little work desk that we have that we call life. And to present us with challenges that we can't account for in our very limited, culturally determined, human, local way of thinking about the nature of reality. So that's why we don't have a choice really, but with the Warren phrase, to have faith, or as I would rather put it, to trust God. We don't really have a choice. And when you're really trusting God, I think the first thing that comes out is a generous and humble lifestyle where you have convictions, and sometimes stronger than others, and you may speak about those convictions, but it's never from a point of superiority.
Yeah, I think only God can love us when we get that way. And I know from my experience, all of the things that I was so wound up about convincing people that I believed, when I began to trust God, I began to experience God more than just be, devoted to an idea or a concept or a list of things.
Yeah.
All right, you've got on your website, you have a number of questions in your about section. I want to see if you can answer those for me.
I doubt it. Okay.
All right.
I have questions?
You do.
Right.
What is the Bible anyway?
Yeah.
What is the Bible?
I would put it this way off the top of my head. Let me try to keep this to a tweet size response. I think the Bible is a diverse collection of ancient writings. This sounds really secular, but let me get to the end. It's a collection of diverse writings of antiquity that model for us genuine experiences of God and journeys of faith and all the complexities that go along with that. And it does so in ancient ways, in ancient language. And so, when I read the Bible, I can connect with it as a person of faith because of, there are parts that I connect with, there are parts that I don't connect with. And as life changes, there are other parts that I connect with more. I mean, I didn't really get into the book of like Ecclesiastes or Job until my mid-40s. And I could say, oh, they're like me. I'm not sure if a 20-year-old can really grasp that. And I'm not, that's just, a fact of life, I think, of just age, maturing and stuff. So I think, it's, and I think it's fair to say I have maybe more of an anthropological view of Scripture, like from bottom up rather than top down. I know the thing that I should say is like, well, this is the Word of God. It's inspired by God, and everything there is directed and guided by God. I actually have no idea what God does. And I don't think the Bible tells us anything about what God does, except for that one verse about, all Scripture is inspired by God, but it doesn't really tell us the mechanism of what that means, and I suppose that's true, but I just don't want to hang everything on a particular theory of inspiration or revelation.
That verse always.
The Bible is this diverse collection of texts where people actually don't say the same thing; they disagree.
That verse you just mentioned about all Scripture is God inspired sounds a little bit like a user agreement on a piece of software.
Yeah,
it's like it's covered all it is. But all right, you covered that a little bit in your second question. You've covered a little bit of it, but it says, I'm sorry. What are we supposed to do with a book like this? You were talking about that. I just thought I'd throw that in because you're already talking about that, actually.
Yeah. Well, right. And the thing is that, not everyone's wired the same way, but I like asking questions like that and thinking about it because I can't avoid it. It's just what I see. And I think, if I can speak for God, I think God's okay with that. I can't help the way I'm born and the questions I ask, and many other people. And so I'm willing to look at Scripture, let's say, in those more anthropological terms, than presuming that I understand how everything works from the top down. I'm not at the top. I'm at the bottom. So I perceive and you see, this is the thing, you see this in the Bible. You see expressions of the nature of God and what God is like from the point of view of, like, say, an ancient tribal people. So God is a warrior fighting your enemies on your side or in front of you, right? That's a beautiful example of a culturally informed or maybe culturally shaped and framed way of talking about the nature of the higher power. And I respect that, but I also look at that as, this is a way of expressing what God is like. I want to see what's here, what theologically is going on here. What are they saying, maybe beneath the surface? What are they assuming about God that I can sort of carry with me and sort of apply in different ways? But, I don't take that and say, well, this is now a frozen snapshot of how we should think of God. Right? Because we have a Bible that progresses and that moves, that changes, that's diverse. We have this New Testament thing we got to think about too, the whole Jesus part, which isn't neat and tight either by any means. But you look at this and you say, okay, it's not a rule book, it's not a cookbook, it's not an owner's manual, it's not a set of instructions, it's a story, and it's diverse, and it's not. There's no attempt. If you just the Old Testament itself, there is no attempt on the part of the final editors of the Bible to streamline the story. The diversity remains because that's part of their expression of faith. And I think an extremely valuable lesson to take away with.
It's interesting that when you said that, it reminded me a little bit of the 12-step movement, where people come into a group and they reach a point where they're willing to say that their lives are unmanageable, they need a power greater than themselves, and then turn their will and life over to that God of their understanding. And at first, sometimes the tribe itself is their God, but millions have actually ended up with a faith in the God that you and I follow, because they found it in community and they found the tribe. And it evolves over time. You watch it evolve as people are involved in that. And
right.
It's sort of a modern picture and encapsulated of, like you're saying, the Old Testament through the New. How, in some ways, it was, as we were talking about, I was talking about science earlier being self-correcting. There were things kind of self-correcting. It's just a lot of times people don't want to follow that. Okay, next question. Why should anyone care about the Bible?
Mm-hmm.
That's on your About page. I'm just...
Yeah, right. Oh, my.
No answer?
No.
Okay.
Not at the moment.
All right, that's fine.
Say the question again.
Okay. Why should anyone care? The first question, these are in order from your page. What is the Bible anyway? And then what are we supposed to do with a book like this? And then why should anyone care?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the kind of stuff I'm still sort of working on. I don't mind saying that. I just, why should I care what this ancient text says? And I think for me, probably the answer at this point in my life comes down to the fact that this interesting and messy collection of books and writings has nevertheless been a central means of grace on the part of the church since a very, very early time. We don't really have a New Testament until, a couple of centuries or later into the Christian era, but there was always the Hebrew Scriptures. That was a part of, that was the language for articulating the nature of faith, which is always being sort of thought of through different cultural categories. This is why we have, Greek philosophy becoming important in the early centuries of the Christian church, because you have to sort of adjust it. Right. You know what I mean? You have to sort of adjust it. So, I think that's maybe why people should care. 'Cause I'm not going to sit here and say, as a Christian, first thing, I'm just not going to care about the Bible very much. I said, no, I think I need to care, and if I don't get how I should care, that's all the more reason to think about it more and to dig in deeper, right? Mm-hmm. So I want to respect the history of the Christian church in all its diversity. That the Bible is really, really important.
Okay. I'm going to group this last little section together because we're running short on time for you. But you said on the same, this is right after the question about Karen, that you tell stories about the Bible and try to make some sense of God. The questions are, what is God up to? What does God want? Is God real? And so what?
Yeah.
Can you answer those in 2 minutes?
No. Well, what I will say, though, is that I think the reason I put that on the website like this is to be provocative, but also, I think more importantly, to let people know that I think those kinds of questions are not bad questions. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, I think, for someone who's, let's say, been a Christian for a long time, I see this in college. They've been raised in Christian homes, and they're in college, and it's not because of classes, it's just because they're away from home. And they have to construct meaning differently, right? It's not circumscribed for them. They're becoming adults. I mean, it's not unusual for me to talk to students and say, I'm just not sure God is real or not.
Right.
And I let them say that, right? They're not the first people to say that, to ask that question, to wonder about that. And I think what they're doing is they're actually, if I could be presumptuous here, I think they're leaving behind a God of their childhood and maybe moving toward a more complex understanding of the nature of God that can't be, controlled quite as easily, which is a difficult thing, but they don't know anything else, right? So I think it's a good question to be asking, and that's why I put it on the website. I think there is no question off the table. There's no question that you can't ask as a person of faith. There's no question that's going to shock God. I can't believe he asked that. There's nothing like that. It's just we're human beings, and I think it's actually an expression of faith to ask questions like that, not evidence that you don't have faith.
Thanks for clearing those up. I was pretty certain you'd be able to do that. No, but I do know, though, people in their 50s and 60s who've waited that long to ask that question. So it's very healthy to ask it early and begin that journey, because I've known people who've been people of faith their whole life and just suddenly it seems stale, or something seems old about it. That they
Right.
All right. Finally, what's going to be the topic of your next book? Have you decided what your next book's going to be?
I've been thinking about it, Greg. I don't really have a specific topic, but it's going to be something about the Bible.
Wow, I could have gone on a limb on that one, I think.
Well, I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, I sent out on my newsletter a question saying, I have some ideas, but what do you think I should be writing on? And there's some really good ideas and some like clusters of agreement on the part of several hundred people who responded. It took me a while to go through those emails. But something about less deconstructing and more just sort of presenting things, just having a vision for the faith and how the Bible fits into the faith that goes beyond deconstructing bad patterns and just sort of like doing a different pattern. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. I don't know what that looks like, and I've had discussions with other people about possible topics. So I'm kicking that around, but I'm planning on in earnest this fall really like working out exactly what I want to do, and hopefully I can start writing maybe in the spring. So we'll see.
So the people who can't wait for your next book, though, you do a blog?
Oh yeah, I do a blog, and I try to put something up maybe about 3 times a week, sometimes a little more. Occasionally a little less, just depending on my teaching and grading schedule and things like that. So that's PeteEnns.com. I can also find it at the Bible for Normal People. Takes you to the same place. And I've got some essays there about the Bible and faith and all sorts of things.
Well, when I work my way back to normal, I guess I'll be included in that group. But
yeah, try it.
It's a great website. Listen, Pete, I really appreciate your time this morning. I know you're busy, and I really appreciate the effort you have put into bringing out a voice that I don't think is heard enough for people of faith to actually experience God rather than just trying to experience a book. So
I appreciate that. Yeah.
Thanks for your time,
Greg.
and look forward to talking to you again sometime.
You bet. See ya.
See you, Pete. Again, Pete Enns' latest book is The Sin of Certainty. Go out and get a copy. I also suggest reading The Bible Tells Me So. All of his books are available at Amazon, and he has a page there just of his books. He's written Bible commentaries, as we mentioned. You can also visit PeteEnns.com, where you can read his daily blog and other thoughts and find out more about speaking engagements that Pete Enns is up to. Well, that's it for this week, our first edition of Thinking God podcast. Next week, we have another great guest when Brian McLaren joins us. So I hope you will join us for that. Until then, if you have any questions, send us an email at podcast@thinkinggod.com. Check us out on Facebook or check our website out, thinkinggod.com. It will develop and add more information as we go along here. See you next week.